Hello everyone. Today we will explore the ways that European socialists, democratic socialists that is, interacted with trends of independence and decolonization in the global south during the Cold War. In the 1930s, European democratic socialists moved in many of the same oppositional circles as colonial activists, yet rarely incorporated blatant anti-colonial policies into their political platforms. Many socialists were uninterested in the topic of African and Asian independence, or themselves held views that were not just subconsciously, but were overtly racist. Communist Europeans were more likely to embrace racial equality, but even they abandoned colonial causes when the Soviet Union asked them to. For example, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, the Soviet Union continued to supply resources to the Italians to boost its own economy and forbade communists from condemning the war. This caused many African and Caribbean activists in Western Europe to turn away from Stalin in disgust. After the war, as we have seen, the British Labour Party swept to power in the UK, and many colonial activists hoped that the party would begin widespread decolonisation. Certainly, they had more hope with Labour than with Churchill's openly imperialist Conservatives. Labour's decolonisation policy, however, ended up being sporadic and messy. Most notably, India, Pakistan, and Burma won independence in 1947. However, it can be argued that the mass violence seen after the British withdrawal was a result of the government's utter mismanagement of the situation. Elsewhere, Labour even fought colonial conflicts to keep the empire intact. Labour saw the British Empire as a vital source of money to pay off Britain's wartime debt to the US. Schemes to extract money from the colonies often ended in utter failure. A scheme to plant peanuts in East Africa, for example, wasted millions of pounds in what has been referred to as the worst fiasco in British colonial history. The French Democratic Socialists in the SFIO fared little better. The French Socialists under Guy Mollet, despite promising peace before their election, backed a harsh policy in Algeria after coming to power, which earned them the condemnation of fellow socialists across Europe. Matters were especially strange as Mollet enacted important liberalizing reforms at home in France, but denied these very same reforms to Algeria. Mollet then joined the UK and Israel in an attack on Egypt in 1956 in the so-called Suez Crisis. All three countries were embarrassingly forced to back down by the US and the Soviet Union, who even threatened nuclear war. By the end of his time in office, Mollet appeared as an imperialist of old, whilst the right-wing nationalist Charles de Gaulle was able to present himself as a peacemaker. Europe's democratic socialists were all members of an international organization, the Socialist International, that provided an important way to share views and collaborate on policies. Gradually, the SI, as it was nicknamed, became more and more responsive to non-European struggles, perhaps encouraged by the example of the United Nations, as well as the role played by SI member parties from Japan and India. By the 1960s, most European socialists had finally adopted anti-imperialist, pro-independence policy platforms, condemning, for example, the efforts of the Portuguese to maintain their empire. The SI, however, remained under the domination of the Labour Party, who were slower to embrace anti-colonialism and were now faced with new crises in Ireland and Rhodesia. A change in power was in order. The catalyst for this change was the Vietnam War. Whilst the UK's Labour government did not send troops to Vietnam, it refused to condemn the war so as not to offend the US. Likewise, the SPD in West Germany was pressured by President Johnson into offering verbal support for the war. Ordinary Social Democrats were outraged at what they saw as their leadership's cowardice in their reluctance to condemn a war that was clearly morally bankrupt. Once more, socialist actions contrasted with those of de Gaulle in France, who had no problem constantly condemning the US invasion. Socialists took to the streets across Europe, linking arms with communists, anarchists, and Christian pacifists. The socialist parties came to realize that they needed to change their policies in order to keep this demographic on their side. Sweden's Social Democrats, by far the most powerful force in that northern European country, led the way. A young social democratic politician, Minister of Education Olof Palme, made headlines by openly speaking out against the Vietnam War and marching with North Vietnamese visitors in protest. As a result of this, the USA recalled its ambassador from Sweden, and Palme was fiercely criticized for his participation in the protest. Palme, however, earned the support of Swedes and subsequently came to power as Prime Minister. He continued to attack US policy in Vietnam, on the 23rd of December 1972, making a speech on Swedish radio where he compared the US bombings of the North Vietnamese capital Hanoi to the bombings of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War, and even the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust. The US government called the comparison a gross insult, and once again decided to freeze its diplomatic relations with Sweden. Palme's actions made him a hero for many European socialists. Two other figures deserve a mention here. The first was Bruno Kreisky, who led Austria as Chancellor during the 1970s. Kreisky sought to use the international socialist movement as a way of making Austria relevant again. He used hot topic incidents such as Vietnam and the Israeli-Palestine conflicts, he himself was Jewish, in order to advance a socialist middle ground between both sides. Despite the fact that both the Soviets and the US distrusted Kreisky's meddling, the Chancellor was able to carve out a space for neutral Austria between both Cold War blocs. The Austrian capital, Vienna, became a space of international diplomacy, and the Austrian Social Democrats reaped the benefits. Palme and Kreisky's increasing ascendancy in the international socialist movement was cemented by the support of the West German socialist Willy Brandt, who ran that country between 1969 and 1974. Brandt was a celebrity politician due to his high publicity appearances as mayor of Berlin during such traumatic moments as the building of the Berlin Wall. When he became Chancellor, Brandt promised Germans a new world and called on them to dare more democracy. He was muted on the topic of the Vietnam War, but directed the energies of the Socialist International into other decolonization battles, such as in the Portuguese colonies and in the apartheid states of South Africa and Rhodesia. Together, Olof Palme, Bruno Kreisky, and Willy Brandt shared a global vision of a more just and cooperative world that was not defined by the exigencies of the Cold War. The high point of their influence, both in the SI and in the wider international community, came in the 1970s. The 70s were a decade of negotiation and compromise, or détente, between the superpowers, and this suited these middle power European states and statesmen who became needed by both sides as important go-betweens and negotiators. The fall of capitalist dictatorships in Portugal, Spain, and Greece offered a great opportunity for these democratic socialists to meddle in the newly democratic governments set up in those countries, and they did so. For example, the German SPD threw money and publicity behind the relatively unknown Portuguese socialist Mário Soares, and he ended up becoming the leader of that country following the 75 revolution. Meanwhile, the independent struggles in the global south all seemed to be going well. The Portuguese were defeated in 1975, and by the end of the decade, white minority rule had even ended in Rhodesia, which now became Zimbabwe. In the US, however, détente was seen by many conservatives and neoconservatives, former liberals who embraced a more assertive foreign policy, as a time of defeat and shame. The election of Ronald Reagan as president ushered in a more assertive American foreign policy, and, together with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the beginning of the Second Cold War. US officials in the Reagan administration came to see the European socialists as problematic opponents rather than as helpful friends. Europeans, for their part, accused Reagan of being an irresponsible cowboy who played with people's lives. Nicaragua became an unlikely battleground between the two groups. In this Central American country, the regime of the corrupt Somoza family was ended by a revolution that broke out in 1979. The Nicaraguan revolutionaries, or Sandinistas, became very popular icons in the European left for their flamboyant style and their calls for a better, more just world. The SI subsequently supported the movement with their money and campaigning. This upset the US right, who not only supported the Sandinistas' enemies, the Contras, but also resented any European interference in the Americas. Relations between the European left and the US deteriorated even further, as US officials outright accused the Europeans of undermining the Cold War effort. The greatest split between European socialists and the US came over the Euro missile crisis. The effort of the Carter and Reagan administrations to modernize NATO's nuclear weapons in Europe was, ironically, due to the calls of West German leader Helmut Schmidt, who was himself a socialist. However, the ordinary socialists of Western Europe opposed any expansion or modernization of nuclear weapons, fearing a Soviet reaction and a subsequent nuclear holocaust. The anti-missile cause was taken up by socialists in the UK, the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, and even West Germany, with Schmidt losing the support of his own party on the issue. Brandt resumed his campaigning, often combining support for Nicaragua and opposition to US nukes in the same speech. The 1980s, however, were a decade of conservative resurgence, and the socialists were voted out of power in both West Germany and Austria. In 1986, Prime Minister Palmer was shockingly murdered, leaving Swedish socialism bereft of its icon. The end of the Cold War made countries such as Austria, which had thrived on its neutrality, suddenly stripped of their purpose. Social democracy came out almost as discredited as defeated communism, and spent the years until the 2008 recession very much on the back foot in Europe. It is only recently that anti-austerity protests have raised hope of a left-wing comeback. To conclude, democratic socialism transformed during the Cold War from a movement that was very centered on the European labor movement and trade unions to being an ideology that embraced a number of worldwide issues. Simultaneously to this change, the socialist demographic gradually changed to include more white-collar, middle-class workers. On the other hand, some blue-collar workers began to embrace conservatism, fearing mass immigration and the loss of their jobs. The end of the Cold War was a disaster for the democratic left, which struggled to find a place in the new neoliberal world.